much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for this marvelous invitation, Omar and all the IDS team. I'm very happy to share with you this lecture. And as Omar said, it is also a part of a current work and a current book I am writing. So it's traveling and crossing many of the texts I have been writing through the years. First, I would love also to thank one of my friends, a curator in Paris, Marianne Yemsi, because this idea also of the lucid dream came from an exhibition that she is curating and that will take place at the Palais de Tokyo in autumn this year. And the title of the exhibition is Ubuntu Lucid Dream. And for exhibition, she asked me to write a text. And I started the text, I sent her the text, and after I continued to think. And so I really owe her something, because many of the ideas I have in this text are coming from those reflections and those interactions with her. And what's more, I would love to thank one of my friend, an artist, a cineast, who is also a translator, and she helped me to translate this text in English, so you will understand what I say with my beautiful and chic French accent during this lecture. So thank you very much for your presence, and thank you very much for this invitation. So the title of this lecture is more like a kind of a meditation. Sorry, I know that this word can seem quite difficult to hear, but it's like a meditation around the question of the independence and the question of the dreams. And I would love just to start with a kind of a quote of Gaston Bachelard that is really relevant for this lecture. I will read it in French, but you always have the translation in English. Nous souffrons par les rêves et nous guérissons par les rêves. We suffer through dreams and are cured by dreams. All cops are banned. In the 19th century, in Europe, an entire body of scientific literature studied the phenomena of dreamlike lucidity. In 1867, a man called le Marquis Hervé de Saint-Denis published a book called Les rêves et les moyens de les diriger, in English, Dreams and How to Guide Them. To understand dreams, to examine the solidarity that is established between life's actions and sleep's illusions, to show that will is not without action on the numerous twists and turns of our imaginary existence. Dreamlike lucidity is specified in at least two ways. There are conscious dreams. We can be conscious of dreaming. But above all, when it is dreaming, the mind is perceptive. It sees what remained veiled in a waking state. The sense of premonition, or a greater clarity of images that line up without moral or social control in one's own intimacy. Dreamlike lucidity can thus be understood in an almost sociological way. With Freud, censorship and repression are powerful principles for the explanation of dreams. However, research in social science on domination, Bourdieu, James C. Scott, for example, shows that censorship is not exercised in the same way in all enunciative contexts. The sociologist Bernard Lahire, you can find the name on the slide, thus states that censorship, both formal and moral, is absent from dream. We are obliged by nothing when we are sleeping. We don't have to be intelligible to express ourselves logically, to be heard by a third party, or even ourselves. Dreaming is an activity of the psyche that escapes social disapproval. Thus, in the intimate space of the sleeper, everything loosens up. The world of the dream is not a space of repression. Repression of images, of desires that a subject would conceal in daytime public life. To make a good impression and or to conform to a set of majoritarian, dominant social norms. Social life is not absent from the dream, but it engages in it uninhibitably, multiplying its gifts or its cruelties. While the dream sometimes opens the door to perceptive viewpoints, it is because the repressive social forces which are exerted on the psyche of sleeping bodies loosen up. An unpoliced space is deployed wherein order is not maintained and offenses are not punished. A territory without uniforms nor military caps. Night standing up. In everyday language, the dreams refers to an ideal projection, imagined in a waking state. Dreamers are not considered to be very productive or being men or women of action. Within the political field, the whole semantics of the dream is spontaneously disqualified. Nevertheless, it is possible to aesthetically, philosophically, and politically resignify the state of conscious dreamers. In a book called L'interprétation des rêves dans la tradition africaine, the interpretation of dreams in the African tradition, the author, Ray Otra, it's a kind of an old book, so it's 1983. But Ray Otra analyzes the plural forms of dream criticism in West Africa. For the Mandika, each human being possesses a dameleke, D-A-M-A-L-A-K-A. This is how it is written, a dameleke. A dameleke is an immortal double who stays awake and never sleeps. The dream is thus the projection of actions experienced by the dameleke over the course of their peregrinations, while the human body sleeps deeply. The dream presupposes the existence of two worlds, that of the dozing body and that of the mind. And the dreamer, paradoxically, experiences an inverted world. When dreams become lucid, the mind is conscious of being on its feet in the middle of the night, of moving around, of crossing lands, of surveying other expenses and other countries. It keeps the memory of its nocturnal journeys when sunrise comes. Frederik van Eeden, a poet from the end of the 19th century, a Dutch poet from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, who also was a psychotherapist, offers a very materialist version of these lucid journeys of the mind. The lucid dream must be considered as the assumption of a double body. The body of the dream separating itself from the body of the sleeper to float and rise up before re-entering it, giving the sleeper great bliss. The work of Frederik van Eeden was studied by Jacqueline Carrois. You can see the reference on the slide in a book that I really love called Nuit Savante, une histoire des rêves. I don't know if it was translated in English. I'm sorry about that. So the dream is not exclusively defined from hardly intelligible temporal sequences. The dream also produces spaces and places where the mind-body settles and roams. The lucid dream is the awareness that the body and or the mind travel freely within dreamlike spaces, breaking with the space-time continuum of daily life. The space of the dream does not have the structure of a panopticon. Nobody of control patrols the wanderings of the dreamer. This place is not the non-space of utopia, which depicts a rational and generalized improvement of human societies. It is a place weaved out of extra dream elements in which the second body ventures while the first body, subject to social habits, doses. Neither is this space a heterotopia, just to quote the famous concept taken from Foucault. This space is not an heterotopia, since the places of dreams have neither real anchoring nor physical borders. This space is sometimes the rearranged world of the day before, in which the body of the dreamer is wholly projected. This recomposition of the world deserves to take place in the social world, the one in which policing norms spy on beings, stopping and containing their motion. So let's go back to Central Africa now. But first, let's go back from the river, from the Americas. The shores of the Black Atlantic are full of lucid dreams, tensioning the world of day and the inverted world of night. The technologies of violence have structured the spaces of Caribbean, American, colonial plantation societies around hierarchies of contempt, race, gender, class, which objectify bodies and wreak lives. The Black archives of the liberation, music, art, text, insurrectional and institutional practices, So the Black archives of the liberation have imagined and traced multiple landscapes, wherein bodies recovered their subjectivity and started to dream again. The journey is the materiality of the dream. Dreamers travel through a space that is quite unlike the ordinary world, and when they return, they push hard to break out of the given in order to extend, sometimes collectively, the unprecedented nature of their adventure. Alternative worlds exist, and they deserve a terrestrial place, such is the daytime stubbornness of lucid dreamers. But I don't want to start out from the experience of the chasm, to quote Edouard Glissant. I would like to stay on firm ground without roaming the Atlantic. My feet rooted in the African continent, paying attention to those who stayed and who also had to confront, but in another way, these hierarchies of contempt. It is true that the African continent rarely appears in the global imagination as a matrix providing lucid dreams. Arendt, as a great reader of Joseph Conrad, reminds us how in the imagination and practices of colonists, Africa, the continent of darkness, was considered as this savage otherness, this phantom world of race, to quote her, where little white gods believed that everything was allowed. It is indeed, firstly, through the tropes which Mudimbe called the colonial library, that the reality of the African continent has long been grasped. Here is how Mudimbe defined the colonial library. It's a famous definition, but if you don't know it, you can have it now in pink. Exploiting travelers and explorers' writings at the end of the 19th century, a colonial library begins to take shape. It represents a body of knowledge constructed with the explicit purpose of faithfully translating and deciphering the African object. Indeed, it fulfilled a political project in which supposedly the object unveils its beings, its secrets, and its potential to a master who could finally domesticate it. Certainly, the depth as well as the ambition of the colonial library disseminates the concept of deviation as the best symbol of the idea of Africa. This order of knowledge, this colonial library, has produced an idea of Africa conceived as the negative of the West. Africa, a negativity then. To get out of the order of the negative, Africa must be saved by itself. To specify Africa as a negativity thus possesses a double descriptive and normative dimension. It's about describing radical otherness, but it's also about ensuring that this otherness becomes other, then it effectively is. Such is the meaning of the colonial gaze that unwittingly tries to save. How to save the other from its otherness? To be same as us. This is what we call development or civilization, or okay. But staying focused on this colonial library, the matrix of our inquiry also remains negative and critical, producing questions such as, how do you get out of the colonial library? How do you produce an African order of knowledge? How do you not repeat the images and representations that come out of this library in the bodies of knowledge that themselves lay claim to liberation? Through these questions that are really important questions, we remain focused on the colonist negative eye. It is nevertheless not enough, as Mudimbe has well and truly shown, to turn to discourses produced from the African continent in order to get out of this library, because a large number of them have been infected by it. However, without naivety, we can examine the type of positivities produced by some of them. Indeed, they don't all frantically position themselves as anti-European. Here it means Europe having become the omnipresent point of reference. They don't all confront the European anthropological knowledge that makes Africa an object without subjects. They don't all lose themselves in an impossible circle, how to think about oneself through categories that one did not come up with. Some of them allow us to grasp a political or intellectual moment that opens in all its positivity. From them, it becomes possible to conceive how the continent in the 20th century has been a great source of political, aesthetic, and intellectual utopias, a great source of waking dreams. Seen from the former French power, the independence of African countries is often tied to one date, reduced to 1 year, 1960, period. One date and then nothing. We know the history and the conceptual distinctions that this date, fixed in the marble of historical chronologies, dragged along with it. The independence of African country were formal and not real. What was put in place, as Fanon or even Sartre said, is neo-colonialism. By neo-colonialism, we can understand in a wide sense the continuous intervention militarily, financially, economically, ideologically, and culturally of imperial powers in the domestic affairs of former colonies. Namely, strict colonialism that mobilizes other means than those of direct territorial administration by the European metropolitan country. What the independence of African countries was pointing to was well and truly a defeat and not a dream. Nevertheless, those who were defeated, fought. And before we stick to the effects of combat, we should perhaps follow the collective dynamics that carried them there. These dynamics appear like so many waking dreams. If dreams are constructed off stage, they sometimes take on a collective dimension. When a segment of the population is subject to forms of systematic, material, or symbolic violence exerted by a dominant majority, lucid dreams become collective and cultural products. I quote here James C. Scott. They call for the inversion of the world. In other words, the radical dismantling of structures of oppression. There are no lucid dreams without explosions. The independence of African countries were such explosions. Explosions. The uninterrupted police pressure on subordinated bodies overheats the mind until the day when that no longer holds. The contained energy is freed, generating with high intensity other possible configurations of the world. Whether they are peaceful or armed, these dreamlike explosions provide new ways to rip through space. They are not pure negations, but upheavals. Each of them converts the daytime forms and figures of power. The political history of violence is always accompanied by another story, that of the prevented or effective explosion of collective dreams. The imaginary discharges that are released are submitted neither to the law of homogeneity nor to the order of the quantifiable. Dreaming is not about producing a program, but roaming the ground of a territory that has become inhabitable. The categories of entrenchment, of subjectivity in its absolute dimension, of ideality, or of abstraction are not suitable for contemplating the politics of lucid dreams. The lucid dream does not move across thoughts. It heats into the real and reclaims its physical inscription in the folds of matter. If there is a refusal, it is that of a realism which in politics rejects the possibility of new rearrangements of the world, namely the effectiveness of projections and practices that dismantle forms of domination. The lucid dream is a refusal, the refusal of the unjust and implacable given. But it is also an escape, a gap that undoes the totality of what is. As a result, the real no longer appears like a prison where subaltern groups are condemned to bow down. The proposition here is not idealistic. Rather, it is rich in material effects. No transformative politics without lucid dreamers. It is about catching a glimpse of madness, the possibility of a world that does not remain as it is. Patrice Emery Lumumba one day had a dream. It took the form of a long and unique poem that still booms like an explosion. Lumumba's dream. So I won't say anything biographical about Lumumba, but we can talk about Lumumba if you want after. But first, I would love to read the only poem that Lumumba wrote in the Journal of the Independence. He's a leader of the independence of the Congo. And in 1959, he wrote a poem in the journal of his party called the MNC, one of the party that built the independence of the Congo. So I will read the text in French, but I found the translation, Callisto found the translation of the text online, so I put the translation in English. I hope it's not going to be too difficult to follow my voice in French and to read at the same time in English, but I think it's good to have the words of Lumumba. So in French, the poem, the only poem of Lumumba is called Pleure, ô noir frère bien-aimé, weep, beloved black brother. So in French, but you can follow on the slides in English. Ô noir, bétail humain depuis des millénaires. Tes cendres s'éparpillent à tous les vents du ciel, et tu bâtis jadis les temples funéraires où dorment les bourreaux d'un sommeil éternel, poursuivis et traqués, chassés de tes villages, vaincus en des batailles où la loi du plus fort, en ces siècles barbares de rapt et de carnage, signifiait pour toi l'esclavage ou la mort. Tu t'étais réfugié en ces forêts profondes, où l'autre mort guettait sous son masque fiévreux, sous la dent du félin, ou dans l'étreinte immonde et froide du serpent, t'écrasant peu à peu. Et puis s'en vint le blanc, plus sournois, plus rusé et rapace, qui échangeait ton or pour de la pacotille. Violentant tes femmes, enivrant tes guerriers, parquant en ses vaisseaux tes garçons et tes filles, le tam-tam bourdonnait de village en village, portant au loin le deuil, semant le désarroi, disant le grand départ pour les lointains rivages où le coton est Dieu et le dollar est roi, condamné au travail forcé, telle une bête de somme. De l'aube au crépuscule, sous un soleil de feu, pour te faire oublier que tu étais un homme, on t'apprit à chanter les louanges de Dieu. Et ces divers cantiques, en rythmant ton calvaire, te donnaient l'espoir en un monde meilleur. Mais en ton cœur de créature humaine, tu ne demandais guère que ton droit à la vie et ta part de bonheur. Assis autour du feu, les yeux pleins de rêves et d'angoisse, chantant des mélopées qui disaient ton cafard, parfois joyeux aussi, lorsque montait la sève, tu dansais éperdu dans la moiteur du soir. Et c'est là que jaillit, magnifique, sensuelle et virile comme une voix d'airain, issue de ta douleur, ta puissante musique. Le jazz, aujourd'hui admiré dans le monde, en forçant le respect de l'homme blanc, en lui disant tout haut que dorénavant, ce pays n'est plus le sien comme au vieux temps. Tu as permis à tes frères de race de relever la tête et de regarder en face l'avenir heureux que promet la délivrance. Les rives du grand fleuve, pleines de promesses, sont désormais tiennes. Cette terre et toutes ses richesses sont désormais tiennes. Et là-haut, le soleil de feu, dans un ciel sans couleur, de sa chaleur étouffera ta douleur. Ses rayons brûlants sécheront pour toujours. La larme qu'ont coulé tes ancêtres, martyrisés par leur tyrannique maître, sur ce sol que tu chéris toujours. Et tu feras du Congo une nation libre et heureuse, au centre de cette gigantesque Afrique noire. This poem by Lumumba was written 1 year before the independence of what would become, after the Belgian Congo, the Republic of the Congo, amid pain and blood. But this independence, whose future was tragic, was nourished by immense collective dreams that never stopped supporting it and being reactivated subsequently. Lumumba's dream, which unfolds in the only poem that he ever published, exemplifies the density of this dream. Beyond the style, admittedly marked by the great writers of the negritude, of course, what is expressed is tectonics. The Black Americas and Africa have never been separated by an ocean. They form one and the same continent. The Atlantic is not the chasm as described by Edouard Glissant. Such is the truth carried by the dreams of independence. Independence in this poem by Lumumba doesn't exclusively concern Africa. It concerns Black men and women considered as the dispersed African people. This independence bears the memory as well as the vision of the future. The memory of all the forms of violence that the continent has experienced, a political vision of reparation. The land of the Congo bear with them the wounds of the slave trade. Central Africa's encounter with the West, which started in the 15th century, the era where the Eurocentric order and a certain consciousness of global space was instituted, opened a cycle of extraordinary violence, to quote the Congolese historian Isidore Ndaiwel, in repeated patterns of collapse. Because words can indeed collapse several times. The slave trade developed after the arrival of the Portuguese in the Congo in 1482. And the kidnapping and enslavement, along with the drain on the labor force, destabilized local institutions and demographics. African lands were turned into a huge reservoir of manual labor, feeding trade channels that were becoming increasingly international. In the 19th century, explorers and colonial societies competed on African soil in the name of European states. The Conference of Berlin in 1885 established the legal terms of the European occupation of Africa, guaranteeing the sovereignty of each European nation and granting them all complete freedom of trade. This conference, which consolidated the rules of commercial imperialism that developed in Africa throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, is to be understood as the point in time when the European states imposed capitalism on the coast of Africa. In the Congo Basin, by then the property of the kings of Belgium, rubber exploitation led to violent forms of extractivism that included the destructions of villages, the appropriation of land, the massacre and mutilation of local populations, the destabilization of collective life, forced labor, and the exploitation of natural resources to profit foreign companies. Congolese lands fueled the development of the Second Industrial Revolution in Europe. Lumumba's dream in the poem from 1959 is the remembrance of all this history of the Congo, the long history of appropriation of bodies and theft of land. To be independent, well, is well and truly to be sovereign, to possess a state, to administer their riches and property, but more powerfully yet, is it to take back their land and reclaim their own. Such is the meaning of Lumumba's waking dream. Africa must demand the return of their own. Those who have experienced the betrayal of the Atlantic, to quote Rita Segato. The betrayal of the Atlantic, whose complicit waves carried away the slave ships and never allowed their occupants to make the return journey. They must demand the return of their own and offer them an inhabitable land. The independence is the political sign of a waking dream, where the Congo, welcoming those who have returned, reunites dispersed families, reestablishing the tie between the deported and those who remained. It thus becomes a land of refuge, that is to say, a land where the conquering Europe no longer kills, where Black and African lives are no longer diminished. What have these dreams become? It will seem that they have crumbled away with the failure of African independences. Lumumba's dream has sunk into the history of post-colonial Congo. The two Congo wars today, which gripped the region with violence in the late 20th century and have continued into the first quarter of the 21st century, have accompanied the revolution of digital electronics, with Congolese mineral resources being introduced into the global market. The systemic violence raging in the DRC supports an international supply systems coupled with a form of national and regional redistribution, of resources. Mass massacres, forced displacement of the populations, rape, the increased vulnerability of human life, etc. The North-South divide is too broad to account for the conflictuality of worlds. The economy of pillage and extraction that has taken hold of the region is supported by international industrial and financial predations, but also by intra-African alliances and a revenue system maintained by national elites. The dreams have sunk, faced with their impossible actualization. However, we would be wrong to believe that they remain stuck in a past date. On this famous year of 1960, which seems to have wanted to make a non-event of the independence. We should perhaps dwell here on the modes of survival of such dreams. Often survivals take a path, that of a story, but not any story. Trinh Minh A marks a distinction between story and history in a chapter of Women Native Author. This is the chapter 5, I think, called Grandma Stories, a chapter that I really love. There is a history as an accumulation of events supporting paternal authority, that which makes it an event for the whole community. And little stories that no legitimization body validates and that are reserved for children, passed down by grandmothers. Grandmothers, as we all know, are storytellers. They develop channels to pass down stories that are separate from history as fatherly lessons. I'm quoting Trinh Minh A. And inscribe those who listen to them in a narrative network which operates their subjectification in a non-authoritarian mode, neither education nor training, but joyful listening. When the collection of small stories that shape subjectivity supply the figurative, imaginary thread of a material claim, it turns into a political force. The passing down of little accounts contributes to the formation of political subjectivities. They are not always constructed through the realization of multiple police, race, gender, class summons, which produce them socially. In this way, in the post-colonial situation, the defeats from big history, the death of the patriarchs at the hands of the colonial violence, did not prevent the continuous transmission of small, non-written stories through the intervention of all women, according to Trimina. They have sometimes taken the paths of family intimacy. There are irremediable losses, but it is rare that we take an interest in what we are told in the intimacy of the family, and particularly, as Trimina reminds us, in what all women tell us. Despite the irreparable loss, fatherhoods were well and truly defeated. They maintain the passing down of little stories, enabling the proliferation of political self-abulation. Political self-abulation does not bring about any totalization of individual experience. Its problem is not who am I, but rather, how does what has been told to me situate me and get me moving? These forms of fabulation are political. They are not melancholic. They continue to produce narrative threads in a world that provides no future horizons. Thus, beneath the great historic defeats, the small stories remain, which are passed down by word of mouth from grandparents to children, like poems that we recite or hear, bearing witness to a bygone age which remains, however, in people's minds. The independencies don't belong only to great history, frozen still as an official date. They also shape family stories. They are passed down from generation to generation. As a result of their passing down, these dreams are never extinguished. They cannot be contained by the prosaicism of the chronologies of defeat. From these small, non-official stories, perspectives change. We would perhaps be wrong to let ourselves be subjugated everywhere by the melancholy of mourning and defeat. There were, however, living memories remain, little stories that are passed down as points of survival. So, to conclude, another history of independence, embodied and dreamlike, can be written that reflects its still active and creative potentialities. Despite the political model and the cruelties that reign in the lands of the diaspora and across the continents, we have to be able to contemplate the survival of dreams despite their falling apart. Not independence as a date, but as a process nearing completion. Thank you very much.